Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of The Process Fixer. I'm your host, Derrick Maines. I am really excited about my guest today. We actually have a long history together, actually longer than we probably even both know because we are actually family. But I have Martin Karaffa with me here today. Martin lives in Germany. He is, and we have these great, fascinating conversations about culture inside organizations because, Martin, as you put it, you're a decoder of culture for global brands and organizations. Welcome to the show, first and foremost, and then tell us what that means when you say you're a decoder of culture.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Derrick. Cousin Derrick, I will say.
Yes.
Yeah. And being a decoder of culture for global brands and organizations, maybe I can give you a long explanation of that.
Please, it's a podcast. We've got plenty of time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Podcasts are great for talkers. And
yes, they are.
No, I'm a recovering advertising guy. I started out in the creative side, but then moved into the kind of strategy side. They call it strategy planning or account planning and things like that. And it's always been a fascinating thing for me what the motivations for human behavior are. So I had many corporate gigs and have worked around the world, and I could go into that in some detail when the details are relevant.
Yes, yeah.
But when my last corporate gig ended here in Munich, after 11 very good years, one of the things I had noticed working on global brands around the world is that we underestimate how important culture is in consumer behavior and also just in managing an organization. So I set out on my own. I'm an independent consultant, and I consult to that. I'm a decoder of culture for global brands and organizations. And I can list my clients, but we'll talk about that later, maybe if it's relevant. But that's all good. I currently work with an organization called the Culture Factor Group in Helsinki, where the data for measuring cultural differences, because, oftentimes we look at cultural differences and we say, oh yeah, we just observe them or, see what's trending on Instagram and call that, having our fingers on the pulse of culture. Well, we don't do that. I use really strong data on how cultures differ from each other in behavior and in attitudes, and most importantly, in values. And when I take that set of data, which is constantly being updated, and make it interact with the reams of data on consumer behavior, values, and attitudes, which most large global marketers own and can't make sense of it. Sure. When you start looking at it through a cultural lens, it suddenly becomes extraordinarily intelligible. And that's what I do. So a lot of semiotics, a lot of organizational advice. How do you get global teams working well together? So that's kind of what I do.
Yeah, I love that. And what I love about it is it's a very, very scientific approach to something that we all deal with. I think particularly as executives, when we're dealing with multiple different generations working inside the same workplace, it's really easy to just shake your fist at the heavens and yell millennials, but what does that actually mean? And why are they different? And fundamentally, how do you manage them differently? How do you communicate with them differently? And what I loved about our last conversation was that really fundamentally their worldview is different. And that really triggered me to think, I tend to I think we all do. We tend to believe that people see the world the way that we see the world. And that's just untrue. And I think as I have become exposed more and more to folks that have international backgrounds, last night I had dinner with a German friend of mine. He just sees the world in a very different way. His
tell me about it, Derrick.
Yeah, right. And there you are in Germany too. I mean, it's fascinating how our upbringing, our culture, current events at that moment in time affect the way that we see the world in a very unique and specific way that our children or grandchildren can't even fathom because they weren't there for it.
Mm.
And that to me was really fascinating about that conversation, because I also thought it was interesting when we talked last about how a millennial from Europe is different from a millennial from the US. And even just geographically, I love to say this a lot of times with executives, truth is truly geographic. You need to go to that geography and learn what truth means there, because if you grew up in the 1990s in Russia, freedom meant starvation. Right? It wasn't a
Oh
good
yeah.
thing when the wall fell. I mean, it was chaos. It was all of these things. So we all have these different perspectives on things, and that's what I was really fascinated about your work. Tell us more about that. How did you get started in doing this, and then how does that translate into marketing, messaging, and communication and culture today?
Yeah, well, there's there's two questions there. How did I get started?
Yeah.
And I have to say, it was simply seeing a necessity to do it. Right? There's so many people who say, "Oh, those people over there, that country, the Germans do this, the Japanese do that." Right? And I could see, like, nobody was really thinking about, well, what am I like? Right? What is it that I bring? How do my values differ? I'm not the normal one. You know, when
Mm.
we start thinking about the people who make a difference in the world, the largest group of consumers are Chinese. I have
Yeah.
worked around the world, and I've tried to sell things to people who have very vastly different values. And it's not like, do I understand them? Do I understand myself? What assumptions, what values do I
Mm.
bring to it? And so the way I started in it is that, after having started working in Australia, that's where I started
Yeah.
my career, and then being transferred to Japan, where I met my now husband,
Yeah.
right? And just looking at Japan, radically different culture, and it's easy for somebody who's an outsider to come in and just say, "Oh, this is crazy," right?
Yeah.
Or this is madness, and
Yeah.
that's kind of almost a sport amongst
Sure is.
Western internet mavens, isn't it? Oh, this crazy thing in Japan. No, not at all. When you get on the wavelength,
Yeah. It makes
everything
total sense.
absolutely perfectly makes sense. You
Yeah.
know?
Just a real quick point on that. There's a television show that became very popular here on Netflix that is all about Japanese culture with children. And I cannot remember it right now, but starting at between 2 and 3 years old, parents begin to send their children out to perform errands on their own, and they give them money, and the kids navigate the city. And sometimes these 3 and 4 year old children are getting on public transportation and going downtown and shopping at the market. And Americans, when that show came out, I think it's called Old Enough, we were just mind blown by this concept of a 3 year old kid using public transportation and buying items at the store and making decisions. And of course, they're still children. They're picking up sticks. They're playing with the local cat. They get, but it was so radical for us to see this, because we're very protectionist here. And it's like, people call the police in the US if they see a bunch of 10-year-old kids playing on a playground without an adult, and they call 911, right? So it was so odd. But then talking to Japanese friends, they're like, our culture is built around, when you see a small child out there, you help them because you understand you went through that experience. You remember your first experience going and helping mom to pick up something at the store. It's just a different mindset.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll tell you a little story. When I first was posted to Japan, I thought, well, got to get into Japanese culture. So I went out and bought a whole lot of DVDs because, it was the early 2000s. You remember DVDs,
I
don't you?
remember DVDs. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of them happened to be a Godzilla movie called Destroy All Monsters, right?
Okay.
It was, classic 1968 Godzilla, and just
Yeah.
amazing stuff. And so I put it there. And when my husband and I started dating, he saw that on the shelf, and he said, this was the first movie my parents allowed me to go to see in the movie theater ever. So apart from it being a mildly romantic moment there, bonding over
Yeah.
Godzilla, but he was 4 when that happened.
Wow. 4.
He was
So
4.
watch a Godzilla movie destroying your home country. That's interesting.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah,
Good
yeah,
choice. Yeah.
of
Yeah.
course. Yeah, yeah, because well, let's just remember he was of what they call the Showa generation.
Okay.
So the memories of the war in
Uh,
his parents' minds was very, very strong. And in many ways, and this is a consumer insight, is that often when you have a nervous culture, a culture is made nervous through having had trauma or disaster. One of the things you like to do, almost to desensitize yourself, is to revisit it. So the more traumatic things are, the more that you get, fantasy and horror sometimes. Yeah, and that's the
Hmm.
case, and that was very much it. So, and remember, Godzilla. This is, you see, this is the kind of thing that people pay me money to tell them, which
Yeah.
I'm delighted to say. Godzilla is actually an interesting character because sometimes he's on your side, sometimes he's on the just is
Hmm.
unpredictable, and he can
Hmm.
destroy you as well as help you, and you just have to negotiate with Godzilla.
Yeah.
And that's very, very. It's often said that was emblematic of the United States, right?
Hmm.
Because the United States, your
Interesting.
friend now,
Yes.
right,
Was your
was
enemy.
big, impulsive, unpredictable, sometimes
Ah,
helps, sometimes make you feel pretty uncomfortable, and sometimes
interesting.
actually has done some things that are quite destructive. So the
Hmm.
metaphor for Godzilla is very much negotiating how Japan sees itself in the new world, dealing with the outside world in many ways that
Hmm.
can be hostile, upsetting, unpredictable, unsafe.
That is fascinating. And I wonder, like, are you familiar? And you may have even recommended it to me. The book Misbelief. Dan Ariely, I think his name is.
Oh
I'm
no, no, tell
reading
us
it.
about it, Derrick.
Well, I'm reading it right now, and it's interesting because what he found in culture, and he was actually one of the American representatives that during COVID was providing a lot of data to the federal government about the spreading of disease and all these things. And of course, now everybody believes he was part of some cabal. He's a some sort of lizard man that did all these kind of crazy things. But he wrote this book because he went out and actually, as he was so ridiculed by so many different groups, he actually went and met with these people and actually sat
Mm.
down with them and tried to understand why. And what he found, he believed he found this pattern that people that had gone through highly stressful situations became very, very open to conspiracy theory. And he actually feels it's a type of OCD where they get into a loop of this self reassuring themselves that, if I'm just washing my hands all the time, it's one thing. They're just consuming all of these things to try to align with their worldview to make them feel like everything is out of control, but at least they understand it. And that was really fascinating to me. And it reminded me a little bit of this conversation because as I'm listening to him this morning talk about this and talk about how, and I appreciate that for a researcher, not going on the attack after these people, but saying, this is fascinating. Would you like to meet up for a coffee?
Mm.
Because I'd love to learn more about why you did this. And what he found was that many of the people that fall into these conspiracy theories are actually highly intelligent people. They just went through some circumstance where stress levels around them increased to a point that they felt like things were out of control. And the only way that they could find control was to consume all of this misinformation and make it part of their persona. And I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, well, would put another lens on that. All of that is
Hmm.
absolutely true.
Hmm.
But when you look at groups of people who've had a trauma, and often a shared trauma,
Yeah.
that's what culture is, because culture is defined. There are many ways to define culture,
Hmm.
but culture is when you have a set of emotional preferences,
Hmm.
right? This is the way I react emotionally generally to stimuli of any kind.
Hmm.
So, for example, one of the perfect questions about culture is, do you prefer to be with other people or do you prefer to be alone?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
that, and of course, everyone says, well, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, which makes it the perfect cultural question.
Yes.
So, but there are groups of people like national groups, national
Hmm.
culture, who share the same thing. They prefer to other people, or they prefer to be alone. And the prefer other people is what we call collectivism, or a lot of the work that I do is based on the work of Professor Geert Hofstede, who originally started saying, how do you measure things? So one of the most important things is individualism versus collectivism, right?
Collectivism.
Do I feel strong because I have something inside my soul and I'm an individual and different? And that's individualism. The United States traditionally scores very highly on that. And then there's collectivism, where I feel strong because I'm part of something bigger. And Japan has changed in that. It used to be very collective, and now it's
becoming more individual.
Yeah, a lot more individualistic, because it can afford to be. When you're a bit skinned.
And is that why? That's funny you say that, because I've always thought of the Chinese really a very collective. Chinese friends that I have, they sort of see themselves as this cog moving culture, moving their whole generation forward. And they tend to not think as much about their individual wealth or their individual well-being, but their generation sort of their country sort of moving forward. Is that, do you tend to see that? Is that more of a Chinese characteristic?
Moving forward is a different thing, but we can see that in collective cultures, you have the what Professor Hofstede called an in-group, which is kind of a value-laden term there. But your group of peers who support, peers and family who support you, right? And when times are tough, you rely on them. Everybody looks after each other. When you start getting rich, you don't have to do that so much.
I see.
So, and that's one of the reasons why countries like the United States has traditionally been more individualistic. Right. I don't care about social context. I don't have to fit into the social fabric. In fact, you're kind of a hero if you don't fit into the social fabric in
very true.
Some generations of the United States. We can talk about that. But one of the places which has become the most individualistic, where everybody is responsible for themselves and their immediate family, funnily enough, is now Scandinavia. And that's because Scandinavia's got richer and richer and richer and richer. Yeah, it's very expensive to be self-reliant.
That is true.
So the culture is going to change. Those emotional preferences are going to change. The less you have to depend on each other. But the reason why I say that's the definition of culture, that when you have enough people who share an arbitrary emotional preference, then that becomes a culture, right? And if that arbitrary emotional preference or that arbitrary emotional tendency happens to be around anxiety or happens to be around anxiety or around what Hofstede called uncertainty avoidance. I'm uncomfortable with ambiguity. Everything has to be known. One of the things that a culture which is nervous does is that nervous people scan the horizons for threats all the time. You're alert to threats, and when, clinical psychology says traumatized individuals are hypervigilant. And so there are cultures which are more hypervigilant. And it won't surprise you to hear that Japan is one of those cultures that are hypervigilant. And it won't surprise you to hear that those people who have recently feel that they're under threat or are facing enormous uncertainty, they're scanning the horizon for threats. And that means I have to take this conspiracy theory seriously, this one seriously, this one seriously. And oftentimes the most traumatic or the most unpredictable is the one that people light on. And that's something, again, that's a complementary way of looking at things. And
I love that. So it's like the farther away that you are, the more stress and uncertainty, the more unlikely you are to accept sort of the Occam's razor approach of the simplest solution is usually the one, the more elaborate, because you're looking deeper for threats. And I think if you think about that from a human evolutionary perspective, right? You can see the threat at your doorstep or the threat on the horizon. If you're well armed and you're prepared, the threat on the horizon, okay, no big deal. It's more the threat on the doorstep. But your vision gets cast farther out, and you can't see as well out there. So you tend to accept a little bit more. You can tell a bigger story when you see the army marching on the horizon. You can tell a bigger story than you can of the two guys knocking on your door at 11 o'clock at night.
Yeah, anxiety and future tripping are the two things that work together, which is the slide which we will share presently. This is a presentation called The Culture Code of the Cool Old Guy.
Yeah.
And I did it for a company called the Concept Bureau.
Yeah, and we'll narrate a little bit because we have people on YouTube and on podcasts, so we want to make sure we explain a little bit about what we're seeing. But this is good.
Yeah. Well, actually, what I'm going to do is I will then paraphrase and read out the slide, and those who are in a non-visual medium will just have to imagine that there are pictures that accompany it. Right. But we're talking about what's cool, and that's another way of saying what's my cultural preference, right? And we decide what's cool. It's much too fast to be rational, and we rely on our emotions to navigate life. And this is something, I talk to a lot of marketers, and they always insist we've got to make a rational case why our product is better, right? But that's not the way we do it. We are creatures of the limbic system, the back brain. And as I said before, the common emotional preferences which shape a culture come from shared formative experiences, because that instills our instincts. Do I like people or do I like being alone? That's an instinctive choice. Now, those formative experiences, some of them indeed come from the genetic structure of the population, but I'm not going to go there because that can be misinterpreted so easily.
Yes.
But one of the things also that it does is those formative experiences, often the family, often when you emerge into the world as a young adult, the experiences you have are going to color you for the rest of your life. Oftentimes there are profound experiences, like you become a parent and your values change. Or you experience trauma. And it's interesting that one of the things you can change is that tendency to be nervous or anxious. And if we are getting more anxious in the USA, then we, is it because we tend to traumatize ourselves? There's so many threats, or so many threats are being talked about. One of the biggest things is nation or region or language. So different language groups have things. Hispanic Americans have different values from what we'll call Caucasian or African American or Asian Americans, right?
Yeah.
And that makes sense because they've had different shared collective experiences. But there's also generations, and this is the part that is so fascinating in many ways. Is that when I entered the workforce, which is in the 80s, I'm a boomer, right? But I'm a late boomer. I'm a yuppie boomer, not a hippie boomer, right?
Okay, yeah.
And I got into the workforce, and I graduated from college at a time when everyone says, yes, you can succeed, give it 100%, leave no stone unturned, you're going to get ahead. And that was almost a kind of trauma that has followed me for the rest of my life, that I now have to say, no, let's be rational about what your capacities are and things. But you can see all of these things, whether it be language, ethnicity, nation or region, trauma.
Something like 9/11. I think that's a collective experience here in the U.S. For me, the area that I saw the smoke from Shanksville. I mean, we were hearing air raid sirens where I was in central Pennsylvania. That sticks with you. You sometimes we laugh about it, and then you laugh about it so you don't cry about it. It's like, what is this?
Derrick, I do know what generation you are from, and can you imagine how much that would make you nervous? right?
Mm.
Whereas
Mm.
if you're talking to millennials, who by definition only came of age and came into
Yeah.
consciousness after the turn of the millennium, which was 9/11, what's their formative, that's kind of history. What's their formative experiences there? And one of the interesting things is that we're not coming of age at that in the first decade of the 21st century,
Yeah.
is we underestimate the trauma of the 2008 crash, and it's really
Oh,
affected
big time.
millennials and Gen Z and their attitudes to money.
Yeah.
So it's just huge. But the interesting thing is here, this is a little, this is a kind of word from our sponsor. One of the databases that I use with the Culture Factor group is called Consumer Culture Intelligence, which we compiled and have updated with Mediacom. So I'm not, because of the nature of our podcast, I'm not going to do the big pitch on how great it is, but we have many ways to measure emotions, and I'm going to just go through here. We're talking here in this presentation that I put together about boomers and their values, particularly boomer males. And there are so many ways in which you can measure the differences amongst cultures. So the first one is, are we optimizers or gratifiers? And there are some cultures that say, nope, I don't need to change. I'm proud of who I am, and I feel really, really good about myself. And there are others who say, yeah, we always have a duty to improve, to make something better of ourselves. And we believe in constant incremental change. They often call that long-term orientation as well. So we're thinking long-term, gradual improvement, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and you keep moving. And it's very interesting because the boomers, as we'll talk about here, take a very different position, which is, yeah, if I can't get an immediate reward, blow things up. Become the disruptocrats, right? And there are all kinds of things, like the number of Starbucks per head around the world actually reflects this kind of optimizer culture, right?
Really?
Yeah, you think that Starbucks is about fast food, fast drink, fast coffee,
Yeah.
get in, go out. But if you actually count the number of Starbucks per head, places like China and Japan, who are this kind of constant incremental improvement Kaizen cultures, they tend to have more Starbucks per head because, and in fact, have lots of Starbucks ripoffs in Japan. But if you think about Starbucks, my Starbucks order, yes, I patronize Starbucks, unlike my European friends who will sneer at that. But I patronize Starbucks, and my order is a grande iced cafe latte with non-fat milk, an extra shot in the special blend, and no ice cubes. Right?
An ice drink with no ice cubes. That's good. That's good, Martin.
Yeah,
buddy.
well, yeah. No. To me, ice cubes just melt and it's watery. So I regard ice as theft. Right? Put the milk in.
But,
right?
I need to get a shirt printed up that says "Ice is theft." That is a really, that's a great.
That's why Europeans, who are this more long-term optimizer thing,
I love that.
They go and say, why is it putting ice in? Why do Americans put so much ice in stuff? Right. Yeah. But the thing is, that ability to absolutely customize and improve and make your coffee better, exactly what you want, is a real optimizer value. Right. And unfortunately, I am out of step with all my other fellow cool old guys, because they're much more give it to me fast, invented fast food, etc.
It's true. I drink for years. It was black coffee. I mean, that's, if I go to Starbucks, I just want a black coffee.
Yeah, just give it to me. I'll get out. Don't.
I just want to get moving. Right. Yeah.
Don't make me study the manual in order to order a coffee. Right? Yeah. So, and I'm going to go through this slide very quickly because there are so many things, and there are only 3 that we're going to want to do. So we talk about me versus we, collective versus individual, which is what we've talked about. Anxiety, we've talked about. There's something called ambition. How much do I sacrifice quality of life for status and success, right? And that is very, very relevant to luxury
Can I
goods.
go back to one very quick thing? When
Yeah.
it says anxiety, Instagram and TikTok are anxious. I got
Oh,
to
yeah.
ask more about that because I will agree. I mean, I have friends and consultants that work for us that are influencers on those platforms, and they talk about high levels of anxiousness. And I'm like, I've experienced anxiousness a few times in my life. Like I could probably count them on two hands. They're anxious all the time.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we have actually have data on that. When you look at TikTok and Instagram penetration and usage, and the data come from various sources, but prominent amongst it is the We Are Social global stat shot.
Okay.
The cultures which, like TikTok, are the most nervous, and there are also, there are other things as well, but partly because TikTok is flippant and trivial. It's a distraction. It's
Wow.
cute, if you are in a relaxed culture and you say, well, how am I going to blow off steam? Well, you'll go and sit on the beach and drink a Corona, right? And it's all very, sunny and beautiful and
Yeah.
positive. Whereas if you say to somebody in an anxious culture, just relax, they go, relax, we can't do that. But what happens is that when you have this level of anxiety, you're looking for distraction, right? So TikTok is full of silly things and
Yep.
filters and influencers being trivial and bright colors and all that kind of stuff, and that's what you do. And it's again, let's take Japan and Korea, two of the most anxious cultures on the planet. Were the ones that had been doing cuteness and little distractions and little characters and things like that for decades before we adopted those and said, no, this is something adults can do, and it's not just childish, right? And the Japanese word for that is kawaii, which means cute. And you often hear, like, here's your little keychain with the local character on it, and everyone goes kawaii. It's cute. And this is easy for, middle-aged or older men such as you and me to kind of say, oh yeah, all this cuteness and things on TikTok and all
It's very true. It
trivial
always
stuff.
annoys me. Right. I'm always
Yeah,
very annoyed by the people that wear ears, and I'm like, what is like that's so annoying. It really annoys me.
it's
But it's cultural.
silliness, it's
Yeah.
distraction, it's amusement, it's something to think about so you don't think about life.
Yeah, I love it's distracted. It's like distracted driving. It's distracted thinking. It
Yeah.
takes you out of the loop of thought and puts you into this place where you feel comfort. Almost, it's like nursing at your mother's breast kind of thing. It's very limbic almost in that regard.
Well, oh yeah, well, it's certainly limbic. That's for sure. Instagram has a slightly different take on this because Instagram is not just for nervous cultures, but it's also for these long-term oriented optimizer cultures. Because Instagram is not about an instant picture sharing app, which is how it was designed.
Started, yeah.
It has become how I show perfection, right, in my life. And that picture that you upload is very much like that, to the point where, as you know, you may have come across the app Be Real, right?
I'm not familiar, but yeah, I'll check it out.
Yeah. And for those who are not familiar with it, I have it on my phone because I was nagged into it by my Gen Z godson, and it says, gives you it like twice a day, gives you an unpredictable prompt that says share your Be Real, and you're supposed to take an unfiltered picture. You can't alter it, you can't upload it from your photo app where you could have edited it, just to show people what's real, right? And it's grown enormously because that's the shtick of it, and it's a kind of anti-Instagram. So and that's part of saying, don't be so anxious. We could go into long things about that. Now, here I'm just going to whip through because we could talk about.
Yeah, please. I know. We just went off on a 5-minute tangent, but that was fascinating to me because.
Well, you see, spinning off on a 5-minute tangent. We're on podcasts. Loudmouth,
we're loud,
opinionated
right?
people like us. That this is our home, right?
That's what we do. Yeah.
Yeah,
I love
but
it.
a lot of luxury goods. This one, ambition is about status. You can measure the countries which are more into luxury goods, and it follows the kind of attitudes. Then there are also cultures which, every culture in the world can cope with abstract thinking, right? So this is not a measure of, oh yes, I'm more intellectual than anybody else. One culture. But how much patience do you have for these abstractions? And there are some cultures that really love abstract thinking, and some that are much more like, give me the meat of what it means to me emotionally. And we can see, you would be surprised, Eastern European cultures are very into abstract thinking, and not surprising, but
Yeah,
also
that's very true.
any culture that has a Latin based language. Because you think about in English, what are all of our words for abstract ideas? And the words are all Latin or Greek based
It's
things.
true.
And so, for example, Latin America, very much into abstract thinking. That's the tradition of magical realism literature and things like that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not going to go through the rest of them, but it has
Yeah.
to do a little bit with, how much information you need, how much buzz you do. Because the three things that define the differences among generations are this individualism, the optimizer versus gratifier, uh, you know, um,
Yeah.
constant improvement, and anxiety.
Hmm.
And for us, in marketing, this one tells you how much you talk about what the product does as opposed to who it's for. This one talks about, is about deferred gratification in the name of getting a perfect thing, or are we alert to new problems? So here, this is how global culture is changing. We've got our individualist, collectivist cultures. Got the short-term gratifiers, give it to me now, even if it's not perfect. We've got the long-term
Yeah.
optimizers, I'll hang out and take trouble for the perfect one. This is boomers around the world.
Oh, wow. And for those of you on the podcast, you need to go to the YouTube channel and check this out, because this is really fascinating to see how this lays out in this grid of quadrants of where, and it's funny how a U.S. Caucasian and a U.S. Hispanic are very different.
Oh yeah, yeah,
You can see based upon the generation how that changes. Wow.
yeah, and it certainly changes based on generation. But one of the things that boomers were raised with is, yes, why wait? Don't deny yourself. Have it now, because we grew up in very secure
Yeah.
environment, where
Lots of little knickknacks and little things like that are just sort of these representations
yeah,
that,
or
of
I
experiences
don't
or
care. I
moments.
don't care if my burger is of the highest quality. I just care that it's fast, right?
Ah, I
Fast
see.
food, right? That's the thing. So, and that's the thing that those who don't have the visual aid should bear in mind.
Yeah.
That boomers
Yeah.
are this very, very short term thing, and the individual versus collective axis is pretty predictable. European countries and the United States, and interestingly, Turkey is kind of
Look at
individualist,
that.
right?
Yeah.
And even the former East Germany is individualist.
Oh,
It's
I see. You've got them set. That would make a lot of sense that you have to separate East German people born in East Germany versus West Germany.
yeah, and the former West Germany is
Yeah.
actually a little more collective, because established after the war was the whole social contract of,
Yep.
we'll work hard, but we'll look after ourselves. And then it's the
Yeah.
same with Japan, because it was very much,
Yeah.
you don't have economic miracles, which is what Japan and Germany both talked about having,
Yeah.
and they had, without saying, well, there is some social contract that we all have to look after each other. And that happens in Japan too. But, the only countries back in the boomer days that were this long-term incremental improvement, kaizen, to use the Japanese word, little improvements all the time, and you have a duty to improve constantly and gradually. The only cultures that were like that tended to be Asian cultures: Japan, Singapore, Thailand, and Thailand still stays there. This is the interesting thing here, right? I am officially,
There you are, Marty.
I've done the the questionnaires and everything, I'm solidly up in the top left-hand corner. Short-term gratifier, highly individualistic, what's in it for me? So we look at this. This is Gen Z. And for those of you who don't have...
Holy smokes. I mean, it is like the whole goalpost just moved on everything.
That's right. Gen Z has got this, yes, I have a duty every day to improve. I'm going to... Constant change.
Wow.
We accept that in Gen Z because constant change means constant improvement. And I'm going to say this. This may resonate with a lot of Gen Z or even millennial people listening to this. And I'm thinking about the American environment now. How many times have your boomer or Xer parents said to you, I see on Thursday you have an hour to spare between soccer practice and choir. Why don't you take up another extracurricular and it'll look really, really good on your college application, right? And you can pick up some useful skills for the future. All of that, we're taught to be future tripping. And boomers did that just because they wanted their kids to succeed and it was a status symbol, but it actually taught a different lesson, right? And so much, much, much more of this long-term optimizer stuff. And, that's one of the reasons why I would posit Japanese culture is embraced so much by the younger generations in the United States, whereas older generations say, oh, that's a bit weird, because you kind of jive with that. And it's interesting because you also see that Gen Z is a little bit more collectivist, a little bit more, I appreciate the social context. And I don't think it takes any imagination to talk about, to realize why, to see evidence of that. Gen Z is all about, what's the social context? What's the implication for other cultural groups and things? And that, of course, is also what often annoys boomers, not me personally. But here we can see this is millennials. I've just added a few where millennials are different from Gen Z. And of course, we can separate millennials into the former East, former West, and they've converged. But Gen Z has moved down, where they're a little bit more collective, right? For Germany. So these are the interesting things. One of the things that we need to recognize is that often Latin America, Hispanic Americans are much more about, it's all very well to do the future tripping, but there's a lot of immediate concerns and immediate well-being and immediate opportunities for pleasure that you really do need to allow yourself, and that's part of the culture. So it's and we can see Argentina there is.
I want to mention something really quickly on that Hispanic thing. There's a comedian, Carlos Mencia, who's been canceled a few times here in the U.S., but we went and saw him recently speak, and I believe I don't think he's Mexican. I think he's either Colombian or Venezuelan. And he was talking about his experience in the U.S., and he said that for the most part, what he saw was that older Caucasian males are very down on the U.S. They are very much about conspiracy theories and all these kind of things. And he says the people who promote the U.S. and are the most patriotic are Hispanic immigrants. And he said, go to any job site on 5 o'clock on a Friday, which is right about the time it is there in Germany. But, go 5 o'clock on a Friday with a 6-pack of Modelo and offer it to a bunch of guys on a job site. And you will hear stories about them saying that this is the greatest place on the planet. They don't want to be anyplace else. They want their kids to be here. They're excited about their son joining the military. And he's like, you don't see older white men talking about their kids joining the military anymore. You see younger Hispanic men talking about their kids joining the military or wanting to be a police officer. And he's like, it's really interesting that all of these things that American males say that they aspire to are completely embraced by Hispanic culture, but they're rejected by the American Caucasian culture. And I was like,
and you can
that was
see,
really interesting.
Yeah, and you can see
it's right there.
That even though they remain on the left-hand side of this chart, that the Latin American cultures and Hispanics have moved to the right, especially Hispanic
Yeah.
Generation Z.
Yeah.
And one of the things I would comment on that, I mean, apart from giving ourselves the caution that stereotypes
Yes,
are
of course.
only are really not always accurate, right? But
Sure.
those general social trends, the way I would interpret it is that horizontal axis. Are you long-term optimizers, constant incremental change versus short-term gratifiers? You know, I'm proud of who I am and the way I am. Is that it's not so much that America is bad, right?
Mhm.
The older white males whom he talks
Yeah.
about,
It's
but
different. Yeah.
America is changing,
Right.
right? Change, always uncomfortable. So
Yes.
if you want to change, you'd better make sure you're changing the right way. You better
Mhm.
make sure it's going to be painful. So change has got to be big and it's got to be permanent. So I often talk about that generation, particularly men in that generation, as the disruptocrats. So you look at particularly Generation X, which had all of the digital entrepreneurs in it. The Travis Kalanick's, who boasted,
Yeah.
"I like to disrupt industries like the taxi industry." There's an advertising agency called TBWA, which is part of the Omnicom group, for which I used to work in another agency, and they say we are the disruptors of categories. Elon Musk is the disruptor, right? Big revolutionary change. Steve Jobs is the disruptor.
Yeah.
And that's how you change. Nowadays, of course, look at the change of guard at Apple, and it is all about appealing to the younger generations who say every year you should do a little bit better. You can
Wow.
optimize this experience. So rather than having the big statement that says, wow, we're launching the iPhone, it's like, we do this, and this is the upgrade, and this is the upgrade. And there's one more thing, right? Is always at the end.
Yes.
But,
Right.
yeah. So even changing that to suit the generations is really what a cultural trend is. It's not like what's trending on Instagram. It's that kind of stuff that I think we need to look at. But this is interesting because let's look at anxiety, because if you plot the level of anxiety, it goes from mildly bottom left to the top
Wow.
right. And it doesn't surprise anybody that Japan and Korea are amongst the most anxious in the world. So right now I'm using the cursor to kind of draw the
Yeah, you can
gradations of
see it.
anxiety.
Yeah.
And we can see that a lot of the cultures that are here, like the Australia, US, UK, the difference between anxiety levels between UK boomers and UK Gen Z is easily 35 points, right? And that on a scale that is out of plus 50,
Yeah.
minus 50,
Sure.
huge. And
Yeah.
all of this, pressure to be constantly incrementally improving means you can't let down your guard. It's part of what makes the anxiety that gives rise to mental health problems so prevalent. It's real. The mental health crisis of younger generations. It's not something where we've mollycoddled people and they feel sad, so they call it depression or something. No, it's genuinely real, because that level of anxiety from the social pressure to improve, coming a lot from boomers and Xers, plus the uncertainty of events on the world stage, very much, it's very noticeable. But I would also say one of the things I'm doing now is I'm pointing to the difference between the UK and Germany Generation Z. Germany Generation Z is actually not that anxious.
No.
And so they're much more stable. They're not scanning the horizon for threats, and often that makes them very complacent. But they've resisted, they haven't followed that trend to the same degree that the English-speaking world has. And perception of threat has been fueled by some very prominent organizations in the English-speaking press, right?
Interesting.
UK, Australia, right? USA,
Yeah.
and things. And if you think about the organization, which I know we're all thinking about, which I won't mention, and compare it to New Zealand, right, which doesn't have such a presence of those kinds of news programs and things
Mhm.
like that, polarizing news programs, they're not so nervous.
They're just not. Isn't that interesting? That
Yeah,
places where that type of media have become prevalent are very anxious, and where it hasn't, they're just not.
yeah,
So it goes to
yeah,
show what you consume is what you become, right?
yeah, and if you think about that, I'm now pointing to Generation Z amongst Hispanics and African Americans,
Yeah.
right? They're not exposed to that media or don't watch those media so
Wow.
much. Germany, in terms of the press environment in Germany, is we have our share of Axel Springer and
Sure.
News of the World and
Yeah.
National Enquirer type publications, but for the most part, the German press is very, very somber and austere and intellectual and doesn't panic very much and doesn't the number of times I watch public access television here in Munich and how trivial everything is. It's like, I often joke that if you stand still long enough in Munich, somebody's going to interview you about, you know, the asparagus season, or
Yeah.
what are you doing for Advent, or something like that. It's
Yeah.
it's astonishing stuff. But I'll
I
just
love asparagus. It's asparagus season in Munich. It's the
Oh,
top of news in the world.
and boy, do we have controversy. Like, everybody loves white asparagus. I like green asparagus. Boy, my Twitter feed is blown up when I said I like green asparagus. But
Yeah.
that's about what we have to worry about here
Yeah. Right.
in Germany in many ways. And
Wow.
that's a false sense of security given
Yeah.
the geopolitical events just to our east.
Sure.
So,
Right.
so it's interesting. But the
Is
interesting
that
thing is,
there was a? Let me interrupt there for a second. Are you familiar with the concept of bike shedding? This was it? Is it Robinson? He was a researcher in. Let me see if I can find this really quickly, because it reminds me of this concept of bike shedding, which essentially is that the Parkinson's law of triviality. It's wasting time and energy on trivial details rather than addressing the important matters at hand. And it's this, they call it the law of triviality. And it tends to happen in certain types of groups when they're faced with something that is a massive undertaking. They tend to waste incredible amounts of time on the triviality of things. And the concept came about, I believe it was a nuclear plant that was being built in Europe, and it was way behind schedule, and they hired consultants to figure out why. And when they went into the planning meetings, they had been in like a 6-month discussion on the number of spaces, a number of places to lock up your bike when you got to work. And they just been in a 6-month, this whole entire thing where they just couldn't get out of it. And it's like, somebody needs to pour the concrete to get the plant started, and they just got stuck in the triviality because they didn't know how to address the bigger problem.
Well, this is interesting because that has to do with this long-term optimizer stuff, right?
Yeah.
One of the things, and you're not alone in noticing this, right? Think about Berlin Airport, for example. How long did that take? Down the street from me, sample of one here. Down the street from me is the city of Munich replacing the streetcar tracks going across a historic bridge by the Deutsches Museum. And it has taken 5 years, right? And they have the sign saying estimated completion 2021, then 2022, then 20. Now they've taken down the sign, right? And part of that is, and it's the same thing with my beloved landlord, whom I love, who were almost too afraid to report a fault to him because he's going to come in, he's going to say, we're going to do this properly. And then you fix one thing, but you've revealed another fault, and then you've revealed another, and we're just going to have to do it. And this is the long-term optimizing thing, right? And that's what it is. There's a tendency then to say, no, we don't have to have this gigantic disruption. But when we face a problem, can we improve our way out of it rather than blowing stuff up and starting again? And sometimes improving your way out of it is actually a pretty good way to go. And sometimes you just have to say, start from scratch. And that was the Berlin airport. They just had to, they had this completely faulty way of exhausting smoke when there was a fire. And they should have just said, okay, start from scratch.
Yeah.
But they didn't. They kept persisting with that. And that's, people say Germany is efficient. What Germany is meticulous, right? And that's part of this what they call uncertainty avoidance. We don't like anything ambiguous or left to chance, which is different from anxiety, by the way. But, and that means that, oftentimes Germany is not efficient. And that's also to do with what we'll call social issues that you have to engineer. How long did it take for Germany to legalize marijuana, which has happened just now?
Oh, wow.
Okay, right now. When over the border in the Netherlands, it's been legal for
forever.
Yeah. Forever. And of course, the police will always check the cars that come into Germany
from the Netherlands. Yeah, sure, of course.
Right. Firstly, because they speed too much. The Dutch drivers say, "Oh, there's no speed limits most places on the German Autobahn," which is not correct. Right.
I see.
And so they always, the police in Germany have a field day writing tickets,
catching
on cars. Yeah. And it's kind of a stereotype joke, that even. So yeah, but that idea that you can fret too much and do nothing is part of this long-term optimizer thing. Now, that pays off sometimes. Carlos Ghosn, who came from Renault and took over Nissan, which is a bit of a basket case at the time in Japan. You may recall that famously. One of the things he said about Japan, and it was a miraculous turnaround, he said what he noticed was that you don't do things quickly. You get all kinds of agreement. And I know that from working in Japan. The word for that is nemawashi, hands under the table. You negotiate everything. You get all the stakeholders involved. You look at every possible outcome, and you make sure that it's all buttoned down. And then it's almost instant that there is dramatic change. But it comes about from this incredibly, now, to somebody of my generation, my cultural background, I would call it tedious, but that's my cultural values. But it turned out to have some miraculous results. And Japan's, development from the end of World War II to today, it just shows that works. That works too.
I've been involved in some dealings with Japanese investors, and they take forever to make a decision. But when they make a decision, they're just like, well, why aren't we ready to move forward with this? Like, you're like, well, we haven't heard from you in 2 months, and they're like, well, we were making a decision. Now the decision is made. We're moving forward tomorrow, and it's like, okay, well, we need paperwork ready.
Been thinking ahead.
Yeah, now they're like, why aren't you ready? Why didn't you prepare for this? And it's like, you didn't even return our phone calls for 2 months.
Yeah, well, and you see, we look at that, and again, I've heard stories like that, and sometimes it's sometimes the Japanese investor has a point. That's the thing. But it's also one of the things is that the culture factor, the group with whom I work as a consultant, has a very large business in Japan, because the Japanese business has recognized that the way that they interact inside Japan is not going to fly elsewhere. So, just understanding it and not putting a stigma on it, like you implied the Japanese investor thought about you, right? Yeah. That, these people are lazy layabouts. Right. Yeah. Not put learning that that's not a behavior which should be stigmatized is also extremely useful. And that's one of the things I love about working in this area, because it goes both ways. And trying to avoid value judgments, and of course, even implicit in the kind of discussion that we've been having right now, are the value judgments just in the language that we use. And, I would urge the listeners not to take our language, our colorful language and our vivid language sometimes, too seriously, or to interpret it as rejecting the values of another culture. So, therefore, now, shall we move on? Because
yes, please. This is great.
Between 2017 and 2023, the entire country, let's forget individual generations and ethnicities, has been moving towards collective or high social context values by 6 points, and long-term optimizer by 5 points. And so the United States is changing. It's very much more accepting of change, and it's very much more accepting of what we'll call collective values. So the cool old guys now, people like me, and maybe you, Derrick, I don't know.
Maybe.
We're the counterculture.
We're the hippies now.
Yeah, we're the hippies, and we love it because, that's how we were raised. We're very comfortable with that. But it's interesting when you start thinking about the historical trends, right? Let's think about the first two generations of the 20th century, right? That's the, people who came of age in between the turn of the century and the 1930s, or World War II, right? They were the ones who went off and fought World War II, right? They witnessed rampant economic inequality. It was the Gilded Age. In Germany, we call it the Grundzeit, which had a lot of wealth generated from industrialization. There was Ataturk's reforms in Turkey, and things like that. We talk a lot about, say, millennials and Gen Z being digital natives, but what we forget is that these people were the first automotive natives. They were radio natives. They were maybe telephone
mechanical natives almost, right?
Yeah, and first,
mechanical.
Yeah, and in my line of business, packaged goods natives, it's a very important thing to do. They were the first ones who didn't make their own soap but bought it. And what happened to them was that all of this positive optimism that came from wealth, the roaring 20s, dashed very quickly. War, empires collapsed. You remember they had a global pandemic too.
They sure did. Probably as big, if not bigger, than the one that we had.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
By some estimates, up to 10% of the world's population was affected.
Well, yeah,
by
and it was interesting because it actually affected young men disproportionately. It wasn't like the COVID-19 tended to affect older people, right, more dramatically. But the previous pandemic, the so-called Spanish flu, and very inaccurate label there. We can talk about that, the history of that. But that affected, robust young men disproportionately. So it was astonishingly frightening. And of course, to top it off, 1929 started this prolonged, almost hopeless economic depression, right? So you look at that. And when they had kids after the war, they raised the baby boomers.
Yeah.
But the values that they had is seeking stability, because anxiety dominated their lives. Now, if you think about what you've read or heard about the 1950s and early 1960s, is that this emphasis on military security. We have to be strong, and economic security, especially through home ownership. So this is like 1950s, we often, in younger generations, say, yeah, that was boring, and they moved to the suburbs, and it was stifling. But that was because it was anxiety, so much anxiety from those multitude of traumas that started way back in the early parts of the 20th century. So they were an anxious generation. They became more communitarian. The talk of freedom, of course, was very important, but the 1950s was kind of the heyday of big government. It was the heyday of unions. And there was so much talk about businesses being responsible to all their stakeholders.
Yeah.
Right. So that was a very communitarian time, not quite collective in the way that, so many people who talk about socialist tendencies view it, but generally an emphasis on community. But also there was a true eye for the future, right? Thought long term, valued staying flexible. The belief that we were going to progress continuously and there would be conscious change, long term change, is astonishing. I mean, George Jetson, I have to tell you, in the canon of the Jetsons, was born in 2022. And by that time, we were already supposed to have flying cars and things like that, right? And words like progress and tomorrow, you think about the Disney content of the 50s and 60s. It was all about Tomorrowland and all that.
About, the future, yeah.
Yeah, the G's of this world were constantly talking up the future. The Monsantos of this world were talking up the future. Yeah. And they always thought that progress was going to happen, right? And they raised the baby boomers. Now, I ask you, Derrick, when we talk about a generation that's anxious, believe in fairness and appreciate social context, and are focused on the long-term future, what generation does that remind you of? That reminds you of Gen Z, right? And
sure.
one of the things that's interesting is that the anxiety which enters Gen Z's lives is often on money. If anxiety focuses you on money, and part of the acceptance, I did a project for a very large German appliance company about Gen Z, and one of the things we discovered was that, of course, they're into refurbished and upcycled, appliances, mechanical things, and everyone said, "Oh, that's because they're environmentally conscious," which is absolutely true because this long-term orientation does that. But one of the things that anxiety does is focus you on money. So their ready acceptance of refurbished goods from a proper brand follows the levels of anxiety of cultures around the world far more than it follows the environmental awareness, right? Because it's cheaper, right? They believe in fairness. I interpret quiet quitting, or in China they call it lying flat, actually, and it's happening in China as well, is a form of kind of guerrilla economic justice in many ways. If you don't expect, I'm going to do what you pay me to do, buddy.
That's right.
What you do. You want me to do more? Pay me more, right? And they certainly focus on the long-term future, and they tend to defer gratification. And we often think, Gen Z, young people, they're impulsive, but far less impulsive than, say, my generation was. And one of the things they do is they do the scrimp and splurge, right? That long-term orientation. Scrimp and splurge. The Japanese word for that is keichi richi, which means cheap rich. And so you scrimp on the necessities and you splurge on the luxuries. Every Gen Z I know has the most expensive iPhone, but knows exactly how many minutes are on their data plan, right?
Sure.
And they do more generic, these long-term oriented cultures like Japan and Germany, the home of generic goods, generic supermarkets. And in fact, generic supermarkets have been imported into the United States from Germany.
Yeah, Aldi is like a big brand here. I mean, that's the only place I shop. I love it. But the funny thing is, my mother-in-law, who's 89 years old, goes there and she's like, "Well, I can't find my brand." Yeah, and I'm like, "Mom, these are made by the same brands. Like, I worked in food years ago. There's only one company that makes that product. They just," and I even showed her the other day. I was like, "It's the same bottle, exactly the same bottle, the same cap, everything." And she's like, "Yeah, but I don't know. The quality of that is questionable." I'm like, "Mom, it's the same product," but she doesn't see that, right? So she sees it as a brand loyalty perspective.
Oh yeah. Well, you see that, and that's the thing that when she and I grew up and first started managing money, I'm sure she manages it better than I do, that's for sure. But but it was always like, if you paid more, you got a higher quality, right? Whereas now very skilled at saying, yeah, do I really need a high quality paper towel? Do
Yeah.
I need a high quality of canned kidney beans? And those are the
Mm,
kind of categories that always move into generics and where they have
yeah.
generics, right? But you save the splurge for things like chocolate, for example,
Yeah.
high end,
Right.
and very much able to work out where it's worth paying more money and where it's not. And here in Germany, there's a kind of thing. My local generic supermarket is called the Pennymarkt, and charming place it is. Everybody who works there is completely charmingly grumpy, and I love them. But one of the things that they say there is their tagline is first go to Pennymarkt, and anything erst zum Pennymarkt, right?
Mm,
Go there, and anything you can't find or isn't good enough,
then
that's when you go to the upmarket supermarkets.
that's
And
smart.
yeah, and in my neighborhood, right, which is kind of upmarket, I don't wish to
Yeah.
boast, it's pretty bougie.
Yeah.
Um, the that's exactly what they do. There are the
Yeah.
generic supermarkets, and there are the premium supermarkets, and you do that, and you know exactly
Huh.
what you're gonna get from each, like fancy cheese, or
Yeah.
alternately, if you do want something, there are people who regard coffee as really important. People who say no, coffee is just coffee, right? And that's where you see a lot of difference. And it really
Mm,
became apparent in during COVID with the shortages of stuff
yeah.
that the things that started disappearing first from the shelves were all those things where generics were had a commanding share, right?
Huh.
And that's because we were forced to look back at basics, the things that we
Yeah.
just bought, not on impulse, but just as a habit. The supply chain had rusted in place,
Yeah. Yeah.
and we couldn't do it. So
That's
that's what it
interesting.
is. Now, the problem is, of course, Gen Z and boomers, because the
Mhm.
boomers are in this picture of a
There's
1950s
the kids. Yeah.
television.
Yeah.
They were there, and this was just stultifying. So people like me
Yeah.
say, "Oh, that's pretty dull," and I have
Yeah.
zagged where others have zigged, and I've been more self-indulgent and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So that's really where the generations happen, right? So how do you talk to how do the younger generations talk to the older generations, right?
Yeah, well, listen, I think this is really fascinating, and I think what it tells me. I mean, listen, first and foremost, as someone who does process optimization and long term collective thinking inside organizations, I'm thrilled that you've just told me that my business model is sound for the next generation. I appreciate that very, very
You're
much,
not
and
countercultural. You're
I
pro
am not
cultural.
countercultural in the work that I'm doing, which the interesting thing is 15 years ago when I started doing it, 20 years ago, it was countercultural.
Mm.
And I think I can see now why it has been so widely embraced. When I go out and I talk about optimization, the frontline employees are the younger ones are the ones that are like, yeah, this is great. We need to be doing this. This makes sense. It's the leaders that are going, well, let's focus on bigger things and let's spend more money on brand. We were talking with a client the other day. We need to do more marketing. And I said, well, we look at the number of leads that come in, and 20% of them you never get to. How about instead of doing more marketing, we optimize the system so that you call the 20% that you don't call already, right? And the younger people in the org are going, that makes total sense. And the executives are like, yeah, but wouldn't marketing help? And it's like, no, it wouldn't help, right? So there's these two conversations that are happening. And I do think that um, you and I last time we talked a little bit about Edwards Deming and his
Mm.
work in the U.S. with optimization and this concept that during World War II, the young men in America were all off fighting. So to manufacture things, you had to use old guys, women, and children. 15% of the
Mm.
children between the ages of 12 and 16 worked in factories in the US. And they couldn't be managed in the way that that their young men counterparts could. So what did executives do? They just cut out middle management and they all went to the floor and they stood shoulder to shoulder with them and they talked to them like human beings. And they said, let's build this together and let's do it for the patriotic reasons and let's save our young boys overseas and all these kind of things. And that American manufacturing machine became this dominant global force that was able to overcome win the war. And even the Japanese afterwards recognized that. And I think we talked a little bit the other day about this. And where the Japanese, when asked after the war, what do you need to rebuild your country? They said, well, give us Deming. Like, I mean, he's the guy who knows how to do this. And they're like, is he a general? And they're like, no, he's some statistician in a factory in Indianapolis that knows how to fix these kind of problems.
Well, so, absolutely. And remember that wonderful concept of Kaizen, which I've referred to earlier, right, is all about people on the shop floor telling you how to optimize the process, right? And the Toyota invention. But I am going to just pause and say, given the business that I'm in, Derrick, I'm just going to say, no, always spend more money on marketing, please. Marketing is always worth it.
Is,
and to be
your public service announcement from the marketers globally was just right there. There's the public service announcement from global marketers.
But spend it wisely. Understand the emotions of the decision which your consumers go through.
Yeah. And listen, Marty, I'd love to have you back because I think this was so fascinating to me. It's really enlightening, particularly as a leader that leads, a diverse group of people, even here in my office. I mean, I have people that weren't born in the US that work here. And I assume that their worldview is my worldview. And it is just not. I recently, one evening, a couple weeks back, I was turned on to and I'm going to completely destroy the name, but I believe it's the Bhagavad Gita, which is this religious text, this Hindu religious text. And I listened to it on an Audible book one night, and my mind was just completely blown because I grew up in a very Judeo-Christian background where everything was unknowable, right? Everything was it's all a mystery, only God knows. And then I listened to the Bhagavad Gita, and this general's talking to Krishna, and he's like, well, what about this? And Krishna's like, oh, that's easy to explain, and explains all of these incredibly deep concepts that I was told could never be understood by human minds. And in about 45 minutes, they explained them all. And I went, holy smokes, like my worldview is very, very limited. And then I come in and I talk to my Indian, I have some folks from India that work here, and they're like, yeah, we're always weirded out by your guys' worldview. Like you're so restricted in your worldview. And I'm going, this is just crazy that hearing one text could open my mind like that to something.
Oh yeah. And it's interesting because I mean, when we talk about spirituality, that's one of the things that's very highly cultural. And I don't want to betray family gossip, but your background was very highly Christian, right?
Very highly religious. My parents were very, very religious, and that comes with lots of scars too.
yeah. But it's interesting because of the way the family itself, and here, listeners, just brace yourself for a little family gossip. Right? No, is that even now, your mother and I are direct cousins, first cousins, once removed. And there are 14 of us. And the way that we negotiate our cultural differences, I have always found just extraordinarily surprising, right? Because as you know some of the personalities involved, they're very different political differences. Yeah. They're very
all over the place.
But one of the things is that I think that the background we all came from was much, much more of this, you got to be flexible, If you think about Eastern Europe, very, very long-term oriented, right? You have to compromise, you have to negotiate, you have to improve, right? You don't throw everything out. You don't kick people out of the family or anything like that. So even within our family, that was, these cultural forces were certainly acting, and I'm grateful for it too.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it gives you that very diverse perspective on the world, and I think it's fascinating to me going through what we just went through over the last hour to truly understand that someone has to be the bridge between this communication, and you have to expect that the other person is not going to be that bridge, which requires you to be that bridge. And I think you as a marketer understand that, but as an individual human being, I have to be able to walk into the other room with 23-year-old Indian developer and recognize that he does not see the world the way that I see it. And there's nothing wrong with that. And it's not up to him to see it through my eyes. I'm the leader. It's up to me to see it through his eyes. And that brings empathy. It brings compassion. It brings long-term shared vision. It's the path forward. And I think so many times we think everybody should comply to the way that we see things, and that just does not work.
Yeah. And it's particularly important now that we see, many, many more people in our community from the subcontinent. You talk about the Indian developer, right?
That's very true.
There are some, and particularly in a workplace, there are some of these cultural differences which are very important. What's the role of the boss? Because India is a very highly hierarchical culture. They're very collective. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying that about your colleague, right? Because this is very different. And those who find themselves in a place like the United States are likely to have a certain different cultural profiles.
Yeah. Martin, this is great. I'm so glad that we did it, and we need to do this again. And I'm going to wrap this one up, but I'm going to have you back because I think we could continue in this conversation about culture and how it affects leadership, because you think about it a lot from the marketing perspective, but truly it is about leading. It is about how do you communicate? How do you lead? How do you improve? Tell us a little bit. How do people find you? Is LinkedIn the best place to find you, or do you have a website?
You will have my name, Martin Karaffa, there, and if you email me at martin@martinkaraffa.com, that's all there. And
I know it's Karaffa, and I know that because mother's maiden name is one of those questions I get asked 100 times through some security thing. So I certainly know
Derrick,
my mother's maiden.
Derrick, let me contradict you on that.
Uh-oh.
Because your family spells it differently, right?
Really?
And this is an Ellis Island-y kind of thing. Right?
I heard there was an Ellis Island story about this with the spelling.
Yeah,
so what is that?
It was the places where, in McKeesport where everybody was registered. And they just, my grandmother's, your great-grandmother's maiden name was Potichniak. Yeah, okay. It is never spelled the same everywhere. But I spell it, the actual Slovaks, and I spell it with two F's, Karaffa.
So I had a girl that I went to high school with that spelled it that way. And we always talked about how it had to be an Ellis Island thing.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and that's my Uncle John, your grandfather, who was the first one. And I think that once that was done, maybe George, the next in line, had that. But by the time they got to Anne and my father, Mike, it was back to the double F's.
Interesting. Well, see, there you go.
There you go.
Mess me up because next time they ask me to spell my mother's maiden name, I'm going to be messed up on it and say, now I'm not really sure what it was.
Well, my job here is done in that case.
Your job is done. Marty, thank you so much. This has been so much fun. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you all for tuning in. And make sure you like and subscribe and check us out on YouTube. Check out the podcast. And make sure you check out Martin's work as well, because it's really fascinating.
Always a pleasure to chat with you, Derrick. We have lots of laughs.
We always do have lots of laughs. We keep it in the family.
You ready? Let's go. Welcome to the process fix to help you see the bigger picture. Derrick Maines is the elixir, cutting waste away like scissor. Woo! Got a problem, he can solve it. He's an expert with the process, so for sure you'll see a profit. Bottom line profit. Analyze the work your people doing every day. Expose the inefficiencies getting in the way. Advise you how to automate, outsource, abbreviate, eliminate, innovate. Now there's more food up on your dinner plate.